Welcome everybody here today. Looks like we got a full house here in Athens, Texas, and some guests. Really happy you could make it. Want to also welcome everybody who's tuning in on the stream from wherever you're at. Some of you won't be hearing this for about a week in countries like New Zealand and Australia and Ireland and England. But we're having a wonderful time so far. We got in last night, a bunch of us, and had dinner together in fellowship. We'll be enjoying a meal tonight and a work party tomorrow. So we're right here at Lone Star Camp, where we hold our summer camp program in the U.S. for all of our young people. We're working on a project to improve the campus, and we have a 5-year commitment here now moving forward. So we're excited to be here. Want to cover a few announcements before we get into the sermon as well. First of all, an exciting announcement. Beginning in February, we will now have Spanish translation of the entire weekly Sabbath service. So what we're planning to do on the 5th of February is record the service like we usually do. We'll have a translator translate the entire thing, prayer, sermonette, sermon, the whole thing, and then put that up for about 8 days, and then we'll post the sermon, just the sermon, after the fact. But that way, people in Spanish-speaking parts of the world will have a service in their language and be able to follow along for the entire 2-hour service. Again, that begins, we'll start recording and translating the first week of February. Also, I ask that you pray for my mom. Shirley Monson is my mom. She's 80 years of age, and she went back in the hospital this week. She was in the hospital for about 5 days and home about 6, and then back in last Monday. I spent a lot of time with her this week, but she has congestive heart failure and kidney failure, and we've unhooked her from everything she was hooked up to on Friday, so she isn't expected to live very long. But she's listening in today. Our family has been through a difficult time. As you know, Nancy and Eric, their son, Michael, died at 33 right before the feast. My sister, Ann Burns, died right after the feast. She was 52, and now my mom. But we also know that we're not the only ones with a tough time, and Mom is really, really in good spirits. She told me, you got work to do, so get down to Texas and do what you have to do. I gave her a hug Thursday night. But pray for Mom, if you would. I want you to go to, let's go to 2 Timothy for a minute. And I'm sorry to get a little bit choked up here, but 2 Timothy, we're gonna look at chapter 4, and we're gonna start in verse 6. And these were the thoughts that were going through the Apostle Paul's mind shortly before he was beheaded. And he says here, beginning of verse 6, he says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand." He says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept faith." He says, "Finally, there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who love his appearing." You know, Paul was right there at the end. I feel that my mom is in that same spot, and she has fought a good fight. She's very positive, and she's ready to go to sleep. It is not easy, and I think, Mom's had a lot of loss, as I just mentioned. in recent times and the family. But we also know, like we heard in the sermonette today, these tests, these trials, they're necessary, and they make us stronger in the end. They're not very easy, not, times of happiness, but they're necessary. I want you to go to First Thessalonians. We'll get through this. First Thessalonians chapter 4. And verse 13. Again, the Apostle Paul is writing. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. And the difference for us, honestly, is the hope of the resurrection. We know, when I hugged my mom Thursday night, I said, Mom, might be your last hug from me till the resurrection. But we'll see you and see Dad and others there. We look forward to it. But without that hope, what we go through would be, frankly, unbearable. But with it, we sorrow. We might shed some tears at the time, but we know that we have to push on. We have to persevere. We have to move forward. And he says here in verse 16, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. And boy, do we look forward to that. With the voice of an archangel and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. He says, therefore, comfort one another with these words. And those are very, very encouraging words, because once we're resurrected, the dead are meet Christ first in the clouds, and we'll meet him next if we're alive and remain to the coming of Christ. Then death is swallowed up in victory, at least for those in that resurrection. And we look forward to that. We know that time is very near. That time when it's time for us to flee, and when it's time for the church, to get that final training, that day is around the bend. We've been saying that for a long time, but we can see it. We look at the world today, and to me, that's comforting. To me, that is, for Mom, her next waking moment will be in that resurrection. And for the rest of us, we got to press on. We got to persevere. Let's go down to 2 Corinthians 4. Just a couple verses before I get started here. 2 Corinthians 4. And like I said, we're not the only family going through tough things. And I understand that, and we pray for you. But 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8 says, we are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, and not destroyed. And that's the mindset that all of us have to have in tough times. I realize that for some going through difficult times right now, it seems unbearable. It might seem like you can't keep going. I can assure you, you can. If you are close to God. And that might mean you have to fast more. It might mean you need to pray more. But you can do it. And it's not going to be a walk in the park. Mr. Schexnayder referred to Acts 14:22. And trials strengthen us, but they're also something that God says you got to go through. And when life is smooth and things are going well, enjoy it, because it usually doesn't last very long. The still waters that David talked about, you're not usually in those. You're in the rapids. So Satan knows that we someday are going to replace him. We're going to be in authority above him. And he does not want us to make it. He does not want us to succeed. And he will do whatever he can do to destroy our faith, to discourage us, to get us into a state of depression or into a state of abject hopelessness. We cannot allow that to happen. And I think when you look at the verses in the Bible, that's where you go in hard times. You find hope, and you see that others have been through some really hard things, and they persevered, and in the end, God did good for them. And he'll do that for you. He'll do that for our family right now as we press through this and other trials that are happening. Not just these things, but other things. But that's okay. We understand that. I want to encourage you because you have two ways to face hard things. You fall apart and quit. You can give up, or you can be an optimist. Be positive, move forward, and you might cry, like I did here. But I think that's human. That's normal. That's what God put in us. But mentally, we won't quit. We're not going to give up. We're not going to, let this get to us and destroy us, because again, we know that God's in charge. He allows whatever happens to happen. He wasn't asleep. It's not that he can't intervene and perform a miracle. He's done it many, many times. But like Mom said, I'm 80. I've lived a good life. I've lived life to the full. I have no complaints. And I'm okay with this. And so learn from that. All right, let's get on to the sermon. Well, actually, I got one more thing I'm going to do before I get into sermon too. This is unusual, but there's something else I wanted to talk about. And that is, and I kind of find it necessary to do this. Sometimes things are said or things are done, and I go, look, I need to address this. And this is one of those things. One of the things you're going to understand about me and Mr. Fritz and Mr. Lawrence, and I think those are the only ministers here today, but all the guys, is look, we're just regular guys. I am not an apostle. I'm not a prophet. I'm not an evangelist. I'm a pastor, and I'm a teacher, and I'm a regular guy, and I don't claim to be more than that. Some people, in different groups have already picked the two witnesses. Others have appointed themselves apostles, and they feel like I'm an apostle, now I can change things. We're not doing that. God is in charge. God will determine who the two witnesses are. We don't have to worry about that. He's got that covered. God will determine who leads the people into the place of safety. God's going to determine each step along the way how that's done. We're just going to work together as a team to help feed the flock and get this gospel preached and the warning message out. And so that's our goal. But like David said in Psalm 22, verse 6, he said, look, I'm a worm. And I agree. I can relate to that. I'm in the camp of those, who also need mercy and forgiveness. So we will let God determine and decide those important things. And in the meantime, we're going to press forward and we're going to do what we can. The buck has to stop somewhere, and I guess the buck stops with me and Church of God Assembly. I will make decisions. Sometimes they're decisions I don't want to make. But at the end of the day, they have to be made. Now the sermon. Okay, let's get going here. We have cleared the air. All right, Deuteronomy 28, and we're going to get this thing going. Deuteronomy 28. All right, this message today, I think it's important. It's one of those things, as it relates to prophecy, that I think we need to have our eyes, God says, eyes open, pay attention, watch end time events. One of the things we're going to do is talk about prophecy and end time things and their fulfillment and how the Bible explains how these things come together. So we want to talk about it. But nearly a third of the Bible, not quite, but nearly a third of the Bible is about prophecy. And we'd be ignoring a third of the Bible if we didn't take the time to cover prophecy and things as it relate to prophecy. And also, I think you can't really warn anybody unless you get into prophecy. And what we are going to be careful to do as a church, and as I've talked to the ministry, and we're all on the same page, is to make sure that we don't make prophecies or get ahead of the Bible and everybody else, and we've got it figured out. We're going to read the Bible, let the Bible interpret itself, and as things are fulfilled, you'll know it. But we'll point out that, hey, these things are coming. Look at these signs. God says when you see the signs, it's like when the leaves start budding on the trees. It's near. And so we have a duty to talk about these things. And many things as they pertain to prophecy are cut and dried. I mean, the things that have already been fulfilled as they relate to Jesus Christ and his first coming. We see the prophecies in the Old Testament, and then we see the fulfillment in the New. And those of you who were able to listen to Bible study last night, I explained something I maybe failed to cover. I can't remember if I covered it going through the gospel accounts. But in the synagogue on the Sabbath, the rulers of the synagogue would appoint people to do readings out of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the law. And then somebody else, or maybe it was even the same guy in some circumstances, would read from the prophets. So they were very acquainted with the law and the prophets. And because they read them on a regular basis, and they divided the law up into 53 or 54 sections. So about every year you're going back through the same material and reading it. And we see in the New Testament, Jesus Christ sometimes being the person reading the prophecy, and then he would expound it as it related or pertained to the time that he was in or things that were yet in the future. And it shocked the people, and they were all like, people wanted to get to the synagogue and hear what he had to say next. But Christ didn't, stay away from prophecy. We shouldn't. And today I want to talk about the place that we find ourselves as a nation and frankly a world with regard to our economics. And the title of the sermon is Economic Collapse Inevitable. And I want to point out why we will have an economic collapse and how that's going to happen and why that's going to happen, as pointed out in the scriptures, and then give you some of the examples of things that are happening right now that point to the fulfillment, end time fulfillment of these things. But when we get back into the chapters on the blessings and the cursings in the Old Testament, we can see clearly that when you obey God as an individual or as a family or as a nation, that you're blessed for doing that. And when you disobey God as an individual or as your family or a nation, you're cursed. There's consequences for sin. And God is very clear in the Bible, shows us what's right and what's wrong. And God tells us, if you do the wrong things, here's what's coming. If you do the right things, here's what I'll do. And I want to go to one of those chapters on the blessings and cursings today to start with, and that's Deuteronomy 28. And I want to start in verse 1. And it says, "Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all of his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings will come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the country." And he goes on to explain the blessings for obedience. You've also heard the flip side. Sometimes, the curses are passed on from generation to generation to the children and children's children. And we see blessings and inheritances passed along in a similar fashion. And so what we're trying to do as members of God's church, and I'm a second generation Christian. My mom and dad were called when I was 7. And so I've grown up, 50, almost 52 years in February. It'll be 52 in the church. But I'm second generation. My kids are third generation. And hopefully the generations are doing a little bit better every time along the way. And we learn some lessons and we're come out of the world and we get more in line with God's law, and it becomes part of who we are and what we do. And we, even with the youth program, have always tried to turn the kids to God. Say, hey, look, we want you to do the right thing so you can be blessed. You know, we want you to have a good life, a blessed life, a life with opportunity and fulfillment. We don't want you to be miserable, negative, and depressed and beat up because you're not doing the right thing. And so we've always tried to turn them in the right direction and entrust them with a little responsibility and say, look, you know, we trust you to do this right. You know, I'm not going to have security out at night to patrol the campus. You need to go to bed and follow the curfew and get your sleep. And don't break camp rules. And we trust that you won't let us down. Now, occasionally we're out and about anyway. We might catch somebody out, or maybe we're just out checking on things, making sure the campus is safe. But the bottom line is we entrust kids with responsibility, and we say, look, don't let us down. And usually that's the most effective way to deal with young people. And if they do let you down, you have to address it and correct it in such a way that you hope it will produce a change and they'll become a better person. And that's the way life is. I mean, we're all that way, right? God has to correct us sometimes. And the whole point of the curses is not because God hates people and can't wait to kill them or punish them, but he corrects the son or the daughter that he loves. And we do that as we raise our kids. And if we don't correct our children, frankly, that's on us, and you're hurting your kids. You need to correct them when they do things wrong. And yes should mean yes, and no should mean no. And there has to be consequences for actions. And if a young person is quick to say, look, Dad, I'm wrong, I should have done that, it's over, go do it. But if they're like, no, I'm not doing it, now we got a problem and I'm going to have to deal with it. And I'm not going to let that go. And God's that way. And he does that not because he hates us, because he loves us. And I want my kids to grow up and be responsible citizens in the community in which they live, and to show love for their neighbors and respect other people, respect authority. And so there have been corrective measures I've taken along the way at times, to get them on that path. And that's what God is doing here with these blessings and cursings. But when we get to the curses for disobedience in verse 15, in at least of this chapter, God says, it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all of his commandments and statutes, which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Now, God didn't just mention the Ten Commandments. He also mentioned the statutes, and I'll just use that as an example. I'll give you a statute in the Bible, the holy days, and the keeping of the holy days. These are statutes. We don't have one of the Ten Commandments relating to it, but certainly we have the Sabbath, and then we have annual Sabbaths, and we have these festivals that God gave us, and he said, look, you're commanded to assemble. You're commanded to be there. You're also commanded to be there on the Sabbath, but when it comes to this statute, this is what it's a commanded assembly or a holy convocation, and God emphasizes that many times in Leviticus 23. And so then you have to ask, do I observe that statute? Sometimes people, well, I didn't go because of this or that today, or I had to, catch a flight, or somebody did and I couldn't make it, or it might be, I'm going to skip out on the last great day. I got to get going. I got work. I got to get back. At least I'll skip out on the afternoon service. I've already done one. The heart is wrong. The heart should be, I want to obey God. I don't want to shorten this. I want to be here to the last second of the last great day. If I can, I'll leave the next day. But the heart and the attitude is to obey and show God that, look, I love these days. I'm not going to shorten them. I'm not going to break that statute. And so God's, he's got these laws and statutes and judgments that are all for our own good. There's not a single one of those things that's a burden. They're all good. Thou shalt not kill is good for you. It's good for my neighbor, that commandment, right? It's good for all of us. It's a great, thou shalt not murder is the better translation. That's a good thing. We can all agree. Thou shalt not commit adultery is a good thing for all parties involved. And these statutes, we all who have grown up in the church or part of it and keep these holy days, value those things. We love the time of year that these things come around, and it's not a burden, or it's not something we feel we have to do, or God's going to punish us. We look forward to them. We love them. We love his laws. We love his statutes, and we like, our lives are built around it. Like, we're already planning for the feast. It's January, but we're talking about get our housing. We got a site already, because you got to go early or you don't get them. But our heart is to obey. I've had people say, well, the law is nailed to the cross. You don't have to obey it. That was a burden anyway. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't obey the law because I have to. I do it because I want to. It's a good law. Your thinking's wrong, and that's the thinking of many Protestants in the world today. But if we look at obedience, disobedience, right, blessings, cursings, we read on here. It says, verse 16, cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the country, cursed shall your basket and your kneading bowl, cursed shall be the fruit of your body and the produce of your land, and the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flocks. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. Sometimes people try to get away from the consequences of sin. And I think we've done that with the vaccine, right? We're going to get away from, God says, look, the disease is a curse, and we don't want the curse, so we're going to take this vaccine and we're going to fix it, and it's all better. And God goes, oh, no, you don't get out of it that easy. And so it mutates, and it changes, and it gets worse. And man, again, trying to escape the consequences of disobedience, is finding himself in a worse and worse situation. And that's why Mr. Fritz and I and the ministers are saying from the beginning, this is not, this temporary time of distress. We are now into the end time. This is going to accelerate. And we see what's happened. Many people have lost their jobs because they refused to get vaccinated. It's been a big deal for people in Canada and Australia. I talked to somebody in Italy. So at least 3 people I know of in these countries have lost jobs for not getting vaccinated. If you live in Canada, say you were in, let's pick Alberta right now. I talked to Vern up there, Vern Russin, and Isabel. And by the way, Isabel Hines says hi to everybody today, and hi to everybody up there in Alberta. But they can't go to a restaurant right now unless they're vaccinated. You need a vaccine passport. So they've lost that opportunity, and other kind of social things that you might want to go do, you can't do if you're not vaccinated. So they're discriminating against the unvaccinated, and it's gotten difficult. And I find there's a fact that many people just miss when it comes to the whole process. And I might point this out. The vaccine adverse event recording system, you've heard of that, VAERS, right? Everybody in here probably has heard of that. Right now, the people with the vaccines admit there's an error in the database. And they say, look, we don't have any accurate recording on the negative effects of the vaccine. And, we really wish we had it, but we don't. It's interesting, back in 1986, when that act that shields manufacturers of drugs from lawsuits and liability, that SHIELD Act of 86 under President Reagan states that the manufacturers of vaccines are required to keep those stats, the adverse event recording system, accurate. And what we've seen in the past with other medications is sometimes they find out they're killing people, or they're harming people. They're doing some bad things, and they yank the vaccine off the market because the negative recordings that are coming in as a result, the negative effects, prevent it from continuing to be used. Now, we have to ask how the pharmaceutical industry right now can have an indemnity shield, and on the other hand, say that VAERS recording system is not working. It's actually the manufacturer's legal responsibility, according to the act itself in 86, that the stats are accurately maintained. So if we got a problem with this vaccine, we can see that, we can then yank it off the market. But yet, sorry, we can't tell you what's happening. Our system's broken. And there's a lot of things coming in, a lot of reports on that. But you can see, once again, Satan behind all this. you can see Satan behind what's happening in the world today, and how what we're going through with COVID. We'll look at some stats here, how they're affecting the economies of the world and what's happening here. But if we try to boil it all down to something pretty simple, we come right back to Deuteronomy 28, and God says, look, curses for disobedience. And we drop down to verse 43. Deuteronomy 28, verse 43. Says, the alien who is among you shall rise higher and higher above you, and you shall come down lower and lower, and he shall lend to you, but you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon you and pursue and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded to you. And they shall be upon you for a sign and a wonder, and on your descendants forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and gladness of heart for the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord shall send against you, in hunger and thirst and nakedness, and in need of all things, and he will be but a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. That's where we're headed. God said it would happen, and it's happening. And when you look at our national debt and you see where the debt has been, where money has been transferred, you realize, look, these scriptures are happening right now. Another sign of the times. I want to go to Proverbs 22, verse 7. It says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. So here God again shows the distinction between the borrower and the lender, or you could say debtor and creditor. And when he says the rich rules over the poor, it means that he usurps dominion over them, and he exercises that dominion in a rigorous and oppressive and tyrannical manner. He takes advantage, right? Because this person's in debt to him, and therefore he can take advantage or demand whatever he wants, pretty much, because you find yourself in a debtor to the guy that you lended the money from. So the borrower is servant to the lender. He's at his mercy. He therefore is forced to comply with whatever demands he's given, and to be subject to the one that he owes the money to. And it's interesting to see that we are $29 trillion in debt. And we have become the lender. We used to be a nation that was leading the charge with a strong economy, and we are the opposite right now. The borrower is servant to the lender. Psalm 37, verse 25. Psalm 37. And verse 25. So I've been young and now I am old. I have not seen, notice, the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging for bread. God, sometimes the righteous are hungry, but it's usually temporary. It might be a test. For the Israelites, they got hungry, and finally God gave them manna. They got thirsty, finally gave them water from the rock. But the point is, the people who obey God and follow his commandments are not the ones you find begging for bread, because they've been blessed for their obedience. And again, that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen temporarily for God to accomplish his purpose. Like he did Job, he took it all away in one fell swoop, in one series of events after another. But God provides for his people, is what this is saying. And of course, we have to do our part. We see that even in the Old Testament, the widows had to go out and glean the fields. It's not like, they made the bread and dropped it off at their house. They had to go out and work for a bit too. Now it's free, but it was hard work. We certainly have third tithe for those who are needy or in a position where they need help, and maybe they've had a catastrophic event in the family, cancer or something that just leveled them financially, or a fire burned their house and they didn't have proper insurance. Who knows? There can be things like that. But we also have widowed people and handicapped people that need it. But God always expects us to do what we can. I was always impressed when I see, go to a grocery store and I'll see guys out pushing carts, and obviously they're mentally handicapped and they have some disabilities, but they're working. And I tip my hat to these guys. Way to go. You're out here pulling your weight, doing what you can, even though you're limited as to what your skills are. And that's what God wants us to be like. I mean, he loves people who do their part, and he's happy to help them. And I think all of us are that way. Like, I want to help the guy who's trying, doing all he can. I want to help the woman who's doing all she can. And sometimes there's nothing they can do, and we all want to help that person because they're in that spot. And that should be our heart, and that should be our desire. Go to 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10. I know this is a little tangent, but we'll get back. 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10. It's a little short on time this week, to get this ready. So I get on a little tangent here and now, but that's okay. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10 says, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." So God points out, look, don't be lazy. Pull your weight, get out there and get a job, do what you can. Right now, there are a lot of jobs, and people, I don't have anything. There's jobs everywhere. It might not be as much money as you want. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is at some point down the line here, those jobs won't be available because a lot of companies are going out of business. They can't find qualified workers that will work, and their businesses are shutting down one after another, and those jobs won't last. They won't be there to come back to. And I know it's difficult sometimes, especially in higher paying jobs. My wife works for a firm where they're requiring the vaccine. Obviously, she said, I have a religious exemption. They haven't fired her yet, but they keep clamping down. It could happen. But again, we're not going to compromise on that. God will provide another means of income, or we'll figure it out. But we will be pushed, we will be challenged, but God says, look, do your part. If you can do something, do it. Get out there, hustle, put the time in. And God says, watch, then I'll take care of the rest. All right, that was my tangent. Let's now go to Deuteronomy 17 for another tangent. Deuteronomy 17. A couple thoughts jumped in my brain, and then we'll get back to the theme. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14. And these are principles governing kings. You might have that little heading that's not the inspired word of God, but just put in here to help you find things quicker. That's why they broke it into chapters and verses too. Originally, it wasn't in chapters and verses, but we go find it, rather than scrolling through the scroll to get to it. Here we are. It says, when you come, verse 14, Deuteronomy 17, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like the nations that are all around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. I mean, that's just common sense. That's the way it should be. And that's what God says. He says, but he shall not, this king now that you put in this position, shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. So basically what God's saying, if you have that position of authority and you're the king, and this would apply really across the board to people in positions of authority, don't use that authority to accumulate unjust gain. Don't use it to get rich. If you're the king, your job is to serve the people, not to enrich yourself and use that office for personal gain. And he says this further in verse 18, it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of the law of this in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. So he's going to take the law of God and he's going to write it out. And that's going to help it stick in his brain. And then it says, and it shall be with him And he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes. That's going to make him a better king. And God wants us, if you're in a position of authority, to study the word of God and try to comply with it and live by it. And that'll make you a better servant, a better shepherd, a better minister, a better member of God's church. And I've encouraged people, there's, maybe counseling for baptism, write the verses out, go through lesson 10, should I be baptized, the Ambassador College Bible Study Correspondence course, and write those verses out so they stick in your brain and study it. One time I was doing teen Bible studies on a Friday night, and I typed all the lessons out and all the verses, right? But now they stick in my brain better. I can get back to them easier. When I started doing Bible studies, I typed all the books, verses up through Acts where I'm at. And then I insert comments from college notes and, teacher's notes from college and good news articles or letters from personal correspondence or books that were written by Mr. Armstrong and others, and put those in the notes and try to make the meaning clear and explain it and make it profitable. Just like if I was teaching a class at Ambassador College, I do the same thing I'm doing on a Friday night so that people don't miss the meaning and we can glean more understanding by going through those accounts. And in effect, that's what God told a king to do. Write it out and keep it with you and refer to it often. And that's going to help you be a better king. It's going to make you a better Christian. And I find that when you're regularly praying and studying, you tend to be more on track, because it's hard to get on your knees before God when you just did something you really shouldn't have done, or you're continuing to do it. It's hard to pray because you've got this wedge between you and God. And we see some verses where God says, you got a problem with, someone, go and fix that and then bring your gift to the altar. But you know what? It's really not going to be as effective until you do that first. Fix that, or ask God for forgiveness and repent. And if you can make it good, make it good. If it's something that's in the past, you can't. Learn from it. Try not to do it again. And then you can pray in confidence to God and you can come before him boldly. You can't come boldly before God if you're constantly in this ditch sinning. So you got to start rooting the sin out so you can be more bold. And that's what the apostles did. And that's what we need to do, is be bold. We cannot be a fearful people. And you will not be brave or courageous and a person without fear unless you're close to God, because God's the one who gives you strength. He's the one who gives you courage. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, is a memory verse. Like, look, but we aren't the ones doing it. It's Christ doing it in us, and then we can do it. There's nothing we can't do. We can slay giants. We can go in the pit with the lions and survive. And we need to be more like that at the time of the end, because God said, am I even going to find faith? Will I find faith when I return? And hopefully he finds it in you and me and others that say, well, we're here. God, I know you're having to use the rocks now. That's who we are. But we're here. We yield to you, and we want to obey you. And we want to be in that kingdom. And we want to help other people get to that kingdom. And so we're not going to compromise along this path. It's going to get a little bumpy, but that's okay. We're going to survive it and move through the hard things. And as as I mentioned earlier, and as I did, sometimes you shed some tears getting through those things, but you come out the other side stronger, and it makes you get back to the Bible more when you go through those difficult things, to have peace of mind and strength to move ahead. But the kings, there's a reason God did this, and you can see the reason he did it. And notice he said, you shouldn't multiply yourself silver and gold. You shouldn't use that office for the wrong reasons. And what we see in the world's leaders today all too often is they're doing the exact opposite of that. They're gaining through unjust means. They're taking advantage of inside knowledge, etc., and accumulating a lot of wealth and power. And it's the opposite of what God said to do. So again, now if you're breaking a law, there's a consequence. And when there's corruption in government, and there's corruption among leaders in the world today and the nations that rule, God says you're going to have big problems because of that, because I'm not going to bless that government or those leaders. In 1 Samuel 8, verse 3, we see an example here of Samuel's sons. 1 Samuel 8, verse 3. And again, this is one of the reasons the economy of America is going to go in the tank, and the economies of the world are in the situation they find themselves, is because of sin and disobedience and corruption. And there are some people, some very wealthy people, that are gaining a lot of wealth through what's happening right now. I found it interesting. I was doing a study a while back, and 8 people on the planet right now have as much wealth as the poorest half of the inhabitants of the earth. 8 people. And there's that huge discrepancy between the ultra rich, the super rich, and people that live in poverty. And again, if we instituted the Jubilee, that couldn't happen, right? Because God had that system built into his financial system, the Jubilee, where land went back to families and somebody couldn't gobble it all up. But we see a small number of families and people with great wealth accumulating even more. And those 8 people that I just mentioned in 2008 and in 2011 made more money, not less, when everybody else lost money. So you got to go, how did that happen? Everybody's losing except you guys. Something doesn't smell right about that. But here in 1 Samuel 8, verse 3, it's talking about Samuel's sons. It says, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside, notice, after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. And we see this in the nations and in the rulers of countries everywhere today. And I'm not saying that's true of every single one. There's certainly probably some good people out there. But what's happening, I want to use social security here for an example of what's happening economically. So you may or may not know this. It's not hard to find. You can go out there and do your own homework. But in 2028, Social Security is going to run out. And this isn't just people out there, conspiracy theorists and others that are saying it. The government and its financial institutions are saying it. So Social Security was supposed to be sort of a safety net, right, for a means to take care of the seniors and those with various disadvantages. So basically, they wouldn't be left by the side of the road. They'd be taken care of. Now, in the 1970s, until current, Social Security became sort of a Ponzi scheme. And we started to take money in the present to pay off debts from the past. So we were borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, and we began to rob, we might say, from the piggy bank. And we were going to pay it back later. But I think most of us know what happens when you take money from the piggy bank. It never ends up back in the piggy bank. And so we started borrowing again from this trust fund, using it as a slush fund, and Congress and the White House used this money from Social Security to pay for whatever they needed it to pay for. And again, we'll pay it back later. Now, in the early 2000s, we realized we had a problem. We're going to run out of money. We're going to have to increase Social Security tax by 10%. Now, it didn't happen because for a politician, that's not really a popular thing to run on. We're going to increase your taxes by 10%. So it didn't get dealt with. We could have fixed this, but we didn't fix it. We did something even worse. And in the early 2000s, what we found is people began to be encouraged to, interest rates went way down, and go get a second mortgage on your house, take the money out and go spend it. That's going to help the economy. And so we did that. And what happened is we increased consumer debt. And then when these debts came due in about 2008, people didn't pay. And people lost their houses. And it got ugly, and there were a lot of people that lost everything. And now what? We have this enormous financial failure in 2008. When the market collapsed, at that point, we really didn't have a good way to put money back into Social Security, that's for sure. And by the time we got to 2011, it was the last time we could have fixed Social Security in 2011. We did nothing. And again, leaders of nations or leaders, any kind of leader in any situation, sometimes has to do the hard thing because it's the right thing and because it's best. And when we are irresponsible financially like this as a country, what we're really doing is indebting our children and our children's children. We're passing the debt to them. And there's going to be a reckoning somewhere down the line, right? So where is the reckoning for Social Security? Now, 2011, we're 2022. We're 11 years past the edge of the cliff. And so in 2028, the Social Security Trust Fund runs to zero. Then what? And that's if everything goes on and we don't keep spending more money on COVID. It's like we just stop spending and just live normal, okay? So it's going to happen before that. We're going to have 86 million Americans in this country for whom this is their primary source of income that will not have it. So what are we going to do? Are we going to just print more money and let inflation go through the roof? By 2028, by the way, we could at that point have 120 million Americans that will need Social Security. I said right now we have 86 million, but by then we're going to have a lot more people that need it. Now, maybe not if they all keep dying from COVID. Maybe we won't. Maybe it'll stay at the 86 million. And I'm not reading into that, but it smells bad. So if you're going to solve the Social Security problem, the Social Security Administration themselves, this is a government institution, said that we must increase Social Security tax right now by 15%, and we must decrease benefits by 20%. And then Social Security will survive to 2030. That's where Social Security is. And I'm just using this. I could go through many examples, financial examples, but Social Security kind of, especially you guys getting close to it, and those of you who are on it, that might be something that rings home, right? You're like, whoa, that's not good. So I mentioned earlier, the United States currently has $29 trillion of debt. The gross federal debt is that. That debt includes debt held by the public as well as debt held by federal trust funds and other government accounts. In basic terms, it can be thought of as debt that the government owes others plus the debt that it owes to itself, that it spent that it doesn't really have. Now, America's high and rising debt matters. And why does that matter? Because it threatens our economic future. Coronavirus is another factor that plays in here. Coronavirus rapidly accelerated our fiscal challenges, and we were already on a path to unsustainable growth. And then this has happened. So how much has coronavirus cost America? Well, they say in America it's cost us $5.1 trillion so far. That's a lot of money. $1 trillion is a lot of money. You know, if you had $1 trillion, by the way, and you wanted to spend $1 million a day, it would take you 2,738 years to spend it. 1 trillion. It helped wrap your mind around it. I heard another guy say that I believe it's a $100 bill, 6 feet high, covering an entire football field. That's $1 trillion. It's a lot of money that we're in debt, and we are 29 trillion. The world debt has reached a staggering $281 trillion, and that was at the end of 2020, and it's going up. I didn't catch a more current statistic, but that's $281 trillion. That means a lot of the world economies are never going to be the same. We can't come back from it, and nothing is changing. We're actually spending more, and we're digging a deeper debt. There was an article in Time magazine, and this was back in 2020, August 17th. It was entitled, "The Next Global Depression is Coming, and Optimism Won't Slow It Down." The world is confused and frightened. COVID-19 infections are on the rise across the U.S. and around the world, even in countries that once thought they contained it. The outlook for the next year is best uncertain. Countries are rushing to produce and distribute vaccines at a breakneck speed, some opting to bypass critical phase trials. Meanwhile, unemployment numbers remain dizzyingly high, even as the U.S. stock market continues to defy gravity. We're headed into a global depression, a period of economic misery that few living people have ever experienced. Most governments today accept a deep economic interdependence among nations created by decades of trade and investment globalization. But those expecting the so-called V-shaped economic recovery, a scenario in which vaccine makers and everybody goes, conquer COVID-19 and everybody goes straight back to work, or even a smooth and steady long-term bounce back like the one that followed the global financial crisis a decade ago, those people are going to be disappointed. He basically says that's not going to happen. The coronavirus has ravaged every major economy in the world, and its impact has been felt everywhere. Now, you're hearing another phrase, and I'm hearing another phrase, and I'm hearing it in Europe, and I'm hearing it here, and it's a phrase called Build Back Better. And our president uses it a lot. And the phrase, if you think about it, implies that we must tear down everything because you got to tear it down before you build it back. So what's happening when you hear this phrase, build back better, it implies tearing everything to the ground and then building a new system of their making, right? Their government and their society of their own device. And that's what's going to be better for everybody involved. And it's called socialism. It's not going to work. The only time we're really going to build back better is when Christ gets back. And we go to Daniel, we see this giant stone comes out of the sky and just smashes this image to pieces and the wind blows it away. That's what's going to happen to all the governments of the world when Christ returns. And then we're going to build back better at that point. What we're going to do in the meantime has to do with more control. It has to do with more money and power. It has to do with greed, all the ways of the world and Satan behind all of it. They mention here also in this article, I'll cut down a little further, the economic impact of COVID-19 will cut deeper than any recession in living memory. The monetary policy report submitted to Congress in June by the Federal Reserve noted, quote, the severity, scope, and speed of the ensuing downturn in economic activity will be significantly worse than any recession since World War II. Significantly worse. And as I mentioned earlier, people think, look, things are going to get back to normal. People will return back to work, and we're going to find a lot of those jobs won't even be there because those businesses will be out of business. And by the way, we know COVID-19 will continue to force many businesses out of business. They're going to close their doors for good. And we also know the government won't keep writing bailout checks indefinitely. That's not going to continue forever. This got us where they got us. Got people into power. You know, politicians do it to get elected. But it's not solving a problem. It's exacerbating the problem. The Congressional Budget Office has warned that the unemployment rate will remain stubbornly high for the next decade, and economic output will remain depressed for years to come unless changes are made to the way government taxes and the way government spends. Those sorts of changes will depend on a broad recognition that emergency spending measures won't be nearly enough to restore the U.S. to economic health. What's true for the U.S. will be true everywhere. I'll also point out a couple other interesting statistics here that I noted. It says half the world's net wealth belongs to the top 1% of the population. The top 10% of adults hold 85%, while the bottom 90% hold the remaining 15% of the world's wealth. The top 30% of adults hold 97% of total wealth, while 1 in 10 people survive on less than $2 a day. So once again, the only solution is God's government. We get back to first, second, and third tithe. We get back to a jubilee. we start to get back to the financial guidelines given by God himself in his inspired word and follow it. And we know that Christ is coming soon. We know that what's happening is unsustainable. And today I'm mainly just talking about the economy. We're not talking about other major factors that are going to weigh in here on end time events. You know, go to Ezekiel 7:19. It says, they will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be like refuse. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They will not satisfy their souls nor fill their stomachs, because it became their stumbling block of iniquity. What God's referring to here in this case is amidst famine, people will throw their gold and silver into the streets because you can't eat it. And because it won't be able to buy you food, because there's no food to buy. It says their gold will be like refuse. And that expression in the originals, the strongest expression of an object of abhorrence. Their gold and silver shall be to them as an unclean thing, is what a lot of the translations say. And why? Because it became their stumbling block of iniquity, because it was the cause of their sinning. They were trying to accumulate more of it in unjust and dishonest ways. And sooner or later, sin always causes sorrow. There's always consequences. And for many, it will be wealth that is their snare for ruin. They could, we've always said, gain the world but lose your soul, so to speak. It's important for us as members of God's church to always keep that focus. Look, you might see opportunity to, trample over somebody else and get ahead financially. And God says, just remember, I'm watching. Make sure you do this in a Christian manner, and we see wealthy people in the Bible like Abraham and Solomon, but there's many, Job, but we see some of these guys use their wealth in a very good way. But we see what's happening in the world today, and often it's not being used in a good way. They're not accumulating that wealth in a fair and balanced manner. They're doing it at the detriment of everybody else. And there's a lot of certainly coveting going on and a lot of unjust things. But riches, basically this verse says, riches are not going to profit you in the day of God's wrath. Your money is not going to be able to save you. It's not going to be able to deliver you or do anything to get you out of the spot that you got yourself in. I want to go to just a couple more scriptures here and we'll end. Let's go to Revelation 18. Revelation 18, and let's read verse 3. It says, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. It says, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And when we drop down a little further, verse 15, it says, the merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing. And he's talking about Babylon here. It is going to fall, and the world's going to mourn it. But you can see the corruption here, spiritual fornication, but also it talks about the merchants getting rich. It goes on to say in verse 16, and saying, alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city? And they threw dust on their heads. And when you see that phrase, dust on their heads, it's an expression for great sorrow. It says, alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles, and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. So the world system is coming down. And this society in which we live, God's going to bring this thing down, and it's going to happen suddenly in an hour. It's the word used. That means a short period of time. And, in the years I've lived, even living out in Pasadena, I saw people who went along with changes in the late 80s and in through the 90s to, go back to Sunday instead of Saturday for church, and people who began to compromise and eat unclean things. And the list is long, as you know, if you've been around. But I saw people who basically sold their soul to get ahead. They got the position as the new minister in the congregation, and in about 5 years they went bankrupt and they all got laid off anyway. We see the example in the Bible where Christ has an encounter with this rich young ruler, and the words used there to describe the rich young ruler are extremely rich. Like, this guy was super wealthy, and God told him, "Look, go sell everything you got and give it to the poor." And he couldn't do it. He walked away. He had great value in his riches and money. He was a Jewish leader. At least all of the signs point to that. And we see what happened in 70 AD, and the Jews lost it all. And maybe this guy lost it all in 70 AD, and he could have laid up treasure in heaven by doing what God asked him to do, but he walked away, and he couldn't do it. And I look at where we're at now. Whatever you do in life, whether it's how you handle your finances, is whether you obey God and follow him in whatever law or matter it is, just remember you can't compromise. You got to do the right thing. And if you get in that habit of no compromise, you get in the habit of, this is going to cost me dearly, but it's the right thing, I got to do it, your reward will be incredible in the future. And you will have looked back, just like Moses did here in Hebrews. Let's go back here to Hebrews 11, and this will be our last scripture today, Hebrews 11. And notice what he did was what we should do. It's examples for us. Hebrews 11, verse 24 says, "By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather," notice, "to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." So Moses' outlook, he had it all. He was a young prince. He was actually being trained to be the successor to Pharaoh. Pharaoh later had a son, and he was a successor, but he had this great training. He had this great instruction, and he had everything, and he walked away from it to do what was right. He looked at the reward. He looked at the kingdom, and he goes, that's more important. It's like the guy who built bigger barns, right? And he didn't know his life would be required that night. We always have to say what's right, what's just, what's fair, what's God want me to do, and just do that. And then also, as I finish, I want to kind of go back to where I started with my mom and the things we're dealing with. You've got to finish the race. You don't get to quit early. You got to go until you die. You're still in it. But, look what happened for Paul, right? There's a crown laid up for him, and there's a crown laid up, he said, for all those who follow in that righteous path. And so we can't let ourselves get so depressed or down or negative that we fall out of this race. And it's going to get harder. It's going to get tougher for us. And I'm in the middle of it. And some of you are in the middle of it. But there should be nothing that will separate us from God, and there should be nothing that will allow us to give up. If you're a wrestler, you don't have anybody throw in the towel. If you're, another kind of fighter, you don't tap out. You don't quit. And it will be difficult. And sometimes you got nothing but prayer and fasting. It's all you got left. But you have to have the same mentality. I have to have this mentality that Moses had and realize this is all temporary. This is all going to pass. And what matters is what God sees in your character and in your life. And all of us need to be molded, shaped. The master potter's at work, and he's trying to develop perfection in us, and he's working toward it. We're not going to get there till the kingdom, but he's working on that. And he's chiseling out the stuff that shouldn't be there. And he's putting pressure where he needs to put pressure to form and shape and mold things. And we're running out of time, so God's going to up the pressure because there's not a lot of time left. And I encourage you to keep your focus and encourage you to just, if you're doing the right thing, and if you're praying and you're studying and you're fasting and you're close to God, you will make it to the kingdom. You don't have to worry, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? You're close to God. He will guide you. If you're not where you ought to be, if I'm not where I ought to be, he'll show that very clearly. I'll show you. I got it. And he'll show you. He doesn't leave or forsake us, right? He's there for us. But you can never let the government of the world or the government of a church, men in church, tell you to do something that contradicts this book and cave on those things. Don't do it. You obey a man as he obeys Christ. You follow a man as he follows Christ. We as human beings are going to have some disagreements. We're human. And there's so many times that I prayed to God and said, man, I wish, could you send Christ here? We can ask the question. We can solve this right now. We just put peace to this situation, but he's not here. And so we have to make judgments and decisions. We don't always, as humans, make the best one. Mr. Armstrong, he wasn't a perfect man. I have huge respect for him. And I feel like when you say he wasn't perfect, you undermine who he really was. He was an end-time apostle. I believe he fulfilled the Elijah commission. I believe that God used him in a way that nobody's been used at the time of the end. Amazing what God did through him and with him. But he would correct you if you hung on every word that he ever said, because he would say, look, I'm a human. Prove it, study it, make sure you know it. I am far below that. Don't believe me, right? Prove it, study it. Mr. Fritz is far below you. Mr. Lawrence is, we're down here, but whatever we say, if it isn't right, prove it. Study it. If we disagree on something, what we're going to have to do is agree to disagree. And then when we get there with Christ, say, okay, you were right. I was wrong. And then we just move on. And that's how we have peace. That's how we have unity. And it doesn't mean you can't ask questions. It doesn't mean you can't present disagreements. But sometimes we're not going to be on the same page on some small matter. All the big stuff, I think we will be. I'm sure we will be. But at the end of the day, eternal life is at the end of this. We cannot get caught up and hung up on things where it takes us out of this race. And so I encourage you to, do your homework, study it. Nobody's going to force you to do something you believe with your conscience is the right thing to do. If we see you're breaking a law, we'll say, hey, you're breaking this law. Your conscience is wrong here. You need to do this. But at the end of the day, we're looking to work together. We're going to have to pull together, pray for one another. We're going to have to uplift and encourage one another. Our Sabbath services should be a very positive place to come. If you're in a small group, is that group negative? Is it gossipy? Or is it a small group that's positive and people look forward to coming there on the Sabbath? And you're there every week because that's your custom, like it was Christ and it was Paul. You just get there and you go. When we were young, I mentioned this before, we lived in North Dakota, 7 miles south of the Canadian border, in the Turtle Mountains by a little town called Bottineau, North Dakota. And we would drive to Canada up to Monson, Saskatchewan, which was 278 miles each way. And we did it every week. We never missed. We had a 54 Ford. My dad couldn't afford, I think, good paint. So he painted the John Deere tractor and then he painted the car the same color because that's what he had. And so we had a John Deere green 54 Ford. It looked like a big green bullet. And it went as fast as a bullet because Dad used to race cars. He's always going fast. And we got up there and back. And I look back and I go, you know what? What Mom and Dad did, God saw. And he saw the heart. He saw the effort. He saw the money and the time that took. And finally, Dad says, you know what? We got to sell the farm. There's no church here. We're going to have to move closer to a church. And we moved up to the capital of Saskatchewan, Regina. And that's where we from the time I was 9 till 18. That's where I lived with the family. But the church was important. God came first. Doing the right thing was always at the top of the list. And I feel that anything you sacrifice or give up or invest into what you're doing, is the dividends will be so much greater than you will ever imagine. That God is saying, I'm going to reward you 100-fold. So if you realize life's temporary, and you realize God's watching, and you realize time is short, why can't we do this? Right? With God's help, we got it. We're going to make it. And that's where I want to end today.
For more information, go to our website at cogassembly.org. Copyright 2022, Church of God Assembly. All rights reserved.